So last class, we left off talking about the civil rights movement, and we made it through the 1950s. We talked about how President Eisenhower was not going to allow the southern states to defy presidential orders. We also looked at Southern resistance to the civil rights movement, including the Southern Manifesto, and we read some letters to the editor about the Montgomery bus boycott. We're going to transition into the 1960s civil rights movement, where we're going to see that the peaceful movement becomes much more active, but it also becomes a little bit more violent during this time. In the 1960s, a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was created, also known as SNCC. These guys were really inspired by the 4 young African-American men who are black college students from Greensboro, North Carolina, who had refused to leave the Woolworth's lunch counter when they were served, until they were served. They were attending Shaw University, and basically SNCC was organized with the help or assistance of Ella Baker. Now remember, we talked a little bit earlier about Ella Baker and how she had helped the Little Rock Nine train for nonviolent resistance. Ella Baker is really the mother of the civil rights movement. She's my personal favorite civil rights activist. She does a lot of nonviolent training and making it possible for a lot of the movement's activities to take place. So this group was an integrated group. They followed Dr. King's call for nonviolence. They helped organize the sit-in movements, and they also organized the freedom rides, and they wanted to really integrate public accommodations and public transportation systems. They did a lot of pray-ins as well. Their tagline was, "Come, let us build a new world together." And if you'll notice here, this young man right here is John Lewis. You're going to see John Lewis throughout the rest of the civil rights movement. He's a very active, and he is the only person who spoke at the 1963 March on Washington that is still alive. He also is a current member of Congress representing a district in Atlanta. No. Sorry about that. Little technical difficulties. In 1961, the Freedom Riders, organized by the Congress on Racial Equality, known as CORE, and SNCC, decided that they were going to really push the issue of the Montgomery bus case, and they were going to make sure that interstate travel was integrated. They began traveling in integrated groups through interstate bus travel, particularly like on Greyhound, etc. And they were really trying to encourage President Kennedy to enforce the decision of the Supreme Court for the integration of interstate buses and waiting rooms. The Freedom Riders faced massive resistance wherever they emerged. In 1961, one of their buses was bombed. You can see that image on the right-hand side of your page. Oftentimes when they would pull into cities, people would pull them off the bus, would beat them. And basically this violence towards these young people that were willing to put themselves at risk really attracted international attention. And the Interstate Commerce Commission actually then enforced and banned segregation in all interstate travel facilities. A freedom rider by the name of Jim Zerwig said, "We will continue our journey one way or the other. We are prepared to die." Most of the resistance was organized within the South, and a lot of it came from Southern governors. Southern communities organized white citizens committees, but a lot of these Southern governors really used their power as governors as vocal opponents of the civil rights movement, and they used their powers as governors to use state troopers, etc., to enforce segregation law. One of the most famous staunch supporters of segregation was Governor George Wallace of Alabama. He is a highly vocal opponent of the civil rights movement. He is a Southern Democrat, also known as a Dixiecrat. He runs for the Democratic presidential nomination 4 times. And when he doesn't secure the presidential nomination in 1968, he runs as an American Independent for the American Independent Party, which is a nativist party, and he ran as a staunch segregationist with a segregation platform. One of his most famous speeches is in which he talks about the importance of segregation in the way of life in the South. And a lot of these Southern gentlemen really believed that integration was a form of tyranny. So he talks about, in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Other Southern governors, we already heard about Orval Faubus from Arkansas. Now we've heard about George Wallace from Alabama. Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi was another vocal Southern governor who was fiercely opposed to integration. So Governor Ross Barnett actually physically stands in front of the schoolhouse door to block the integration of the University of Mississippi. Now remember, all state institutions are paid for by tax dollars from people in those states. So even though African Americans paid taxes towards public universities, public school system, they were denied admittance to a majority of those public institutions. And so James Meredith, who was an Air Force veteran, actually takes the University of Mississippi to court, and he wins his court battle to enroll at what was previously an all-white college, the University of Mississippi. Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, physically refused to allow him to register, blocking the door of the school. Meredith receives death threats. President Kennedy has to order federal marshals to escort Meredith to school. Thousands of white protesters flooded the school in September. Riots broke out. 2 people died in the riots to try to prevent the integration of Ole Miss. And Meredith had to be escorted to school by U.S. Marshals, and his home had to be guarded for months and months and months after there was an attempted shooting on his family. Ross Barnett called on every Mississippian to keep his faith and courage. We will never surrender. So we have to remember, this was a real challenge to the doctrine of white supremacy in the South, and the long-held institutions of segregation. And a lot of white Southerners were willing to do whatever it took to prevent integration. Probably one of the biggest turning points in national and international public sympathy for the civil rights movement were the events that took place in Birmingham. And y'all are going to watch a movie after I finish my lecture here that's going to take you into the events at Birmingham. In 1963, Birmingham was a quintessential city of resistance. Birmingham was really one of the cities in the South that had the worst reputation for racial violence. They called it Mommingham. It was a pivotal location in the movement because Dr. King knew if you could get people to march in Birmingham, the movement could only grow. The black community in Birmingham was terrified of stirring the pot. Dr. King goes to Birmingham to organize demonstrations. He is permitted to lead marches, but he is still arrested. And this is when he writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. How long are we supposed to wait? Justice delayed is justice denied. And the older community in Birmingham is too terrified to challenge the powers that be in Birmingham. Now, you got to remember, their jobs are on their line, their mortgages could be on the line. And so in May of 1963, the young people of Birmingham are the ones who rise to Dr. King's call. And thousands of young people through a 2-week period march on the streets of Birmingham, challenging crossing across what was called Kelly Ingram's Park, which was the buffer zone, the line between white and black Birmingham in the downtown area. The police commissioner in Birmingham was a man by the name of Eugene Bull Connor. He had a tank. He enforced segregation law to the T. He used fire hoses and police dogs on the marchers. The first day of the march, 959 children were arrested and put in jail. This was a marching and jail packing situation. TV captured it all. Remember how I talked about how the media was one of the tools that the civil rights activists used? Well, in this case, the national news and the international news broadcast the fire hoses being sprayed on these children, the dogs biting these children, the children singing, marching, and then being met with severe police violence. President Kennedy, this is the turning point for President Kennedy. He is sickened by what he sees in his morning papers, and he then turns and actually begins to then take a stand for civil rights, which is something that his brother Bobby had been trying to get him to do for years. But this was the instance that really was the tipping point for President Kennedy. Are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to ourselves, that this is the land of the free except for the Negro? The tactics used by the resistance to civil rights: they bombed places, they burned places, they would beat people, they used intimidation, lynching. We see murder as a tactic, like we saw with Emmett Till. We also see Medgar Evers, one of the other leaders of the civil rights movement, being gunned down and killed. They would use their state National Guard as a tool to break up protests. They would use their state police and their local police forces, and the police used a vast amount of violence towards protesters. They too protested. We also saw riots breaking out during this time period. So we really see, here we see the Selma March and the breakup by the Alabama State Police. Here we can see protesters as late as the 1970s protesting the integration of schools. This is closed mixed schools. Communist Jews are behind race mixing protests. Anti-integration of schools. Civil rights are unconstitutional. My personal fave. And then here you see the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This was the church that played such a pivotal role in the Birmingham Children's March. This is where they organized. This is where the marchers started from. So it was a strategically chosen location. It resulted in the death of 4 young girls, 4 young women. But we also see in 1963 the first official March on Washington. And right here down in the front, you can see A. Philip Randolph, who way back in 1942 wrote about why we should march in the Double V campaign, getting his March on Washington. This is one of the largest public protests in D.C. in its time period. 250,000 people marched on Washington, demand that Congress pass the Civil Rights Act that had been proposed by President Kennedy. It was an integrated movement, and we begin to see that at this point, the Civil Rights Movement is not just about equality within society, but we begin to see a push for jobs and an ending of poverty in America as well. This is also when Dr. King delivers his most famous speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the I Have a Dream speech. It's also a pivotal turning point in the civil rights movement. From 1964 into the 1970s, we begin to see the movement fracturing. We begin to see Dr. King increasingly fighting for an end to the war in Vietnam and fighting for an end to poverty in America. We also see a lot of the younger activists becoming very frustrated with the slow pace of change that is happening. And so we begin to see some disunity within the movement, and it's causing kind of mixed results and backlash. Many people began to become frustrated with poverty, unemployment, and abuses by the man, meaning the white man. And we begin to see that a series of urban riots begin to break out. We see the emergence of the Black Power movement, and we see some people pushing for like full societal revolution at the time. Dr. King, as I said, is increasingly fighting for the rights of the poor and against the Vietnam War. Here you can see an image of Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who are protesting the status quo at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. This was a highly controversial move where they raised the Black Power salute during the national anthem. They were expelled from the games, but they really felt something that was necessary to make a statement to society that all was not well. Another major success during this time period is the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which had been championed during that March on Washington. Meanwhile, President Kennedy has been assassinated, and President Johnson has taken over for President Kennedy. President Johnson also, very interestingly enough, even though he is a Texas Democrat, is really committed to the civil rights movement itself. The Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation of public accommodation, banned racial discrimination in hiring, union membership, and any projects receiving federal funds. It also established the Equal Opportunity Commission, which is a commission that was set up to investigate any times of racial discrimination or prejudice in hiring, kind of like the Fair Employment Practices Committee that was started by Roosevelt during the war. President Johnson, as I said, is a very interesting character. We're going to talk a little bit about him in a minute. In 1964, it's also known as the Freedom Summer. Core and SNCC, who had organized the Freedom Rides, now begin to push for voter registration drives in the state of Mississippi. They're trying to register as many African American voters as possible. They they start to create what are called freedom schools. They're really trying to push the issue of people understanding that access to the ballot box and access to understanding what your constitutional rights are the key to then political, social, and economic equality. Thousands of white college students volunteer to register voters. A third of these college students are female, and we really begin to see this is another spark for that next wave of feminism, because even though women were highly active in the movement, all of its leadership was male. And we begin to see young women learning tactics within the civil rights movement that they're then going to apply to the feminist movement later. This is also where we see 3 volunteers murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi, murdered by the Klan and by local police officers. It's open secret in town, and it becomes the subject of a major Hollywood movie by the name of Mississippi Burning. The FBI is sent in to investigate, and basically people are stopped at every turn from finding the truth of what happened. President Johnson also begins to push for what he calls his war on poverty. Now, President Johnson's an interesting character because he was, before he became a politician, he was a teacher and a principal at a segregated Mexican-American school in Texas. He understood poverty. He grew up poor in rural Texas. He then worked with the poor in rural Texas, and that's really what encouraged him to then go on to the House of Representatives and start his political career. And so he really begins what he calls his Great Society program. He doesn't believe that in a country that has the excess of wealth that we have, that anyone should live in poverty. We have the opportunity to move not only towards the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. He saw poverty as the #1 barrier to equality. And he began job training programs, education programs, healthcare programs, environmental protection programs. And Dr. King is also increasingly working on these poverty issues. They both are in agreement about these issues. We see the Economic Employment Act, which creates Job Corps, Vista, and other ways to retrain people so that they can get better paying jobs. We see a cut in income tax rates, 30%, with the greatest cuts in income rates going to the lower income Americans. The Civil Rights Act is signed into law. The Wilderness Preservation Act, protecting national forests from development. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides school systems with money specifically targeted towards low-income students. We see Medicare and Medicaid created. We see the Voting Rights Act pass, which ended literacy tests. We also allowed federal supervision of voter registration. We see housing provided for low-income Americans. We see the Water Quality Act. We see the Clean Air Act. We see Higher Education Act, which is the creation of scholarships and low-interest loans like the Stafford loans for college students. We see National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. We also see the Air Quality Act. So we see a lot of environmental, but also job training, healthcare, and education acts that are passed within the Great Society because President Johnson really believed that we should use our tax dollars to better the lives of all Americans. In 1965, in order to push for voting rights, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC organized a campaign to register black voters in Selma, Alabama. Many were arrested for demonstrating, and a man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. In March, Dr. King organized a march to Montgomery, famously known as the Selma March, and Governor Wallace sends the Alabama State Police to break up this march. Police used tear gas, whips, clubs to break up the march, and of course this also was then captured on television. And on March 31st, President Johnson sends federal troops to guard the marchers. 3,000 start the march in Selma, and by the time they reach Montgomery, there are 25,000 marchers. This is a direct link to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which had eliminated literacy tests as requirements for voting. The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men. President Lyndon Baines Johnson. President Johnson really believed in the power of the vote. We also see that the elimination of poll taxes is constitutionally added at this time in the 24th Amendment. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. Malcolm X is highly, highly misunderstood figure in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, he did not necessarily advocate for violence, but he didn't advocate for nonviolence. He just didn't understand why people would lay there and take it. And you got to remember that Malcolm X comes out of the Nation of Islam, which is the black separatist group. He advocated for the separate black and white societies. He's really moving on the same vein of like Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, this idea that if whites don't want blacks integrated within white society, then they should leave blacks to then create their own black society that's separate but equal to white society. Malcolm X is very, very interesting because he, as any good Muslim does, he takes his pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, the Hajj. And while he's in Mecca, he has a complete revelation. He realizes that under Islam, right, the term Islam means equality under the eyes of God. And he realizes that people all over the world practice Islam, and they are all at the Hajj. They're all circumnavigating together. They're all conducting worship together. They're all stripped down to just men in all white, women in all black, and there's really no difference between them. And he really has this epiphany that he's been going about this all wrong. So he comes back to the United States and he breaks with the Nation of Islam, and he begins to talk about building love and an integrated society. And unfortunately, he's executed or assassinated by his former group, the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X he said, "I am for violence if non-violence means we continue postponing solution to the American black man's problem just to avoid violence. And we begin to see that he's really a catalyst for what becomes known as the Black Power movement. One of the originators of this Black Power movement, Floyd McKissick, defines Black Power as putting power in the hands of Black people's hands. We don't have any, and we want some. That's simply what it means. It was started by Stokely Carmichael and Floyd McKissick. Stokely Carmichael had been a member of SNCC. Floyd McKissick was a member of CORE, and they were really, really frustrated with the slow pace of change. They wanted self-determination. They wanted self-identity. They wanted to create their own goals as a Black society. They rejected white society. They rejected bigotry. And they then began picking up that mantle of this separatist society. They were really, really heavily influenced by Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, and the early preaching of Malcolm X. In 1966, a group called the Black Panthers is created. They are formed in Oakland, California. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale are their founding members. They believed in self-defense. They wanted to fight against what they perceived as police brutality. Well, there was police brutality. They were willing to arm themselves to protect themselves within their own communities. And this terrified a lot of white people within the United States. And in fact, the Black Panthers did an armed protest outside of, or they might have been in the halls of the California State Legislature. And this actually led to the banning of guns in public places in the state of California. They advocated for self-sufficiency of African American communities. They wanted decent housing and full employment. With their donations, they started daycare centers, free breakfast programs, free health care clinics, and other social programs for people within their communities. We also see from 1964 to 1967 a series of urban riots breaking out. 43 American cities, mostly in the north, suffered from riots. People were killed, property was destroyed. In 1964, there were riots in New York. In 65, there were riots in Los Angeles. In 1967, there were over 100 different violent riots and crashes across the nation. And in 1968, probably the largest riot, which was actually outside of the Democratic National Convention, which was really actually about the war in Vietnam and not necessarily about civil rights. People were tired of oppression. They wanted economic equality, good jobs, decent housing, quality education. And unfortunately, the Great Society is increasingly, which was an attempt to address these issues, is increasingly getting overshadowed by United States involvement in Vietnam. 1968 is really a huge turning point in United States history. Two major influencers and leaders within the civil rights movement and within basically this revolution that's going on in American society at the time, Dr. King and Robert Kennedy are assassinated. Robert Kennedy was President Kennedy's younger brother, Bobby. He was the Attorney General of the United States. He had been appointed in his brother's cabinet. He took on the mob. He was really outspoken against the war in Vietnam. In April of 1968, Dr. King is killed by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee. He's not there to talk about civil rights. He's actually in Memphis to organize a march for the city's sanitation workers. They're trying to get a pay raise. They're trying to get a decent, livable wage. And Dr. King is then assassinated as he comes out of his hotel room to go to dinner. Bobby Kennedy is running for the presidency in 1968. He is trying to secure the presidential nomination. He's in California trying to secure the nomination from California delegation. And he is assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel. This is actually one of the last pictures taken of Bobby Kennedy when he's alive. He's walking through the kitchen to go out to give his to give his speech, and he is greeting the workers through the kitchen. He was very well respected by the poor, particularly within the state of California. by the workers of the migrant farm workers. He had marched with Cesar Chavez in the United Farm Workers Movement. He really believed in fighting for and advocating for the rights of workers and the poor. And so he was assassinated, and it looked like he was probably going to secure the Democratic nomination. Both of these men had moved from just advocating for civil rights to advocating for the rights of the poor, voting rights, and desegregation within society. There are many, many, many legacies of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. These encourage future groups to fight for equality and protest for social justice, including the anti-war protests, Students for Democratic Society, the free speech movement that erupts during the 1960s, the counterculture movement, United Farm Workers Movement, La Raza Unida, the Brown Power Movement, the American Indian Movement, the fight for international human rights, the environmental movement, most recently the immigrants' rights movement. And we begin to see that the tactics that are used as nonviolent protests that have been inspired by Gandhi are now being used by groups fighting for all different causes. We also see continued challenges of the civil rights today. We are seeing a resurgence of white supremacy in the United States and white supremacist ideology. We see this very clearly in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the Torchlight Parade of the Unite the Right rally. We see an emergence of a protest for the recognition of police brutality and the shooting of unarmed African Americans by the Black Lives Matter movement. And we see, again, sports being used as a venue for protest with Colin Kaepernick and his decision to kneel during the national anthem to try to cause awareness of the continued legacies of civil rights issues, and in particular police brutality against African Americans. So the civil rights movement is by no means over. It has resurged again in our modern period, and I look forward to watching how it evolves through our next period of history.